Atherosclerosis. Probably the most common disease ever. In the US alone, atherosclerosis causes over 1 million heart attacks each year, 40% of which are fatal. Furthermore, sudden cardiac death is the first sign of AT in over 450,000 people every year. Sneaky, sneaky. Worst of all, it's not just found in adults either. In fact, the early stages of atherosclerotic plaques start forming in kids and teenagers, especially now that childhood obesity is becoming more and more common. So I guess at my age, my arteries probably look like, I don't know, the tip of a used toothpaste tube, I guess. You know, it's got that gunky rim that you accidentally touch your brush with each time. Ugh. And a bit of the dried, gunky stuff comes off onto your brush. But you just kind of shrug it off. It's a slow process, is what I'm trying to say. All right, let's set up the scene. Before we can get into the pathophysiologic processes of atherosclerosis, and yes, I said processes as in plural. This is about to get unnecessarily complicated. It's important to first picture the normal anatomy of the vessel wall. And since atherosclerosis is a disease of medium and large vessels, we'll focus on those specifically. Starting from the inside and moving out, vessel walls are composed of the tunica intima, media, and externa. In this scene, the innermost intima will be represented by the sand, with some scattered sand dollars to remind you of the single layer of endothelial cells coating the lumen. These cells don't look all that interesting, but they're actually extremely metabolically active and are the first line of defense against vascular troubles such as thrombosis, bleeding, and inflammation. They control the balance between vasoconstrictors and vasodilators, oversee the growth of vascular smooth muscle, regulate the coagulation cascade, and much more. Deeper in the intima is connective tissue, and finally, a basement membrane and internal elastic lamina. This is all before we get to the media, which contains a bunch of smooth muscle and elastic tissue, as symbolized by the layer of smooth muscle seaweed. Smooth muscle cells make up the bulk of medium and large arteries. They play several important metabolic roles as well, such as regulating vascular tone, and consequently lumen size, and modulating vessel extracellular matrix production. In addition, both vascular endothelial and smooth muscle cells produce inflammatory and anti-inflammatory mediators, growth factors, and chemotactic factors. So much more than meets the eye. Underneath is another elastic lamina, this time the external elastic lamina, before we get to the tunica externa, also called the adventitia, which contains a bunch of connective tissue along with a network of larger blood vessels called the vasa vasorum. Yep, it's blood vessels feeding blood vessels. The vasa vasorum penetrates into the media and supplies oxygen and nutrients to the outer 2/3 of the media not reached by simple diffusion from the blood flowing by in the vessel lumen. Now, I don't know if I properly set up the scene yet, because we're not just at any beach. This is a deserted post-Victorian steampunk pirate beach. The perfect place to hide some buried treasure. Or, in this case, bury some cholesterol into the intima of the vessel wall. You'll see. As I mentioned earlier, the intima and media are involved in several metabolic pathways important for vascular hemostasis. So with so much strict regulation, how is atherosclerosis able to come in and cause such significant damage? Well, there are multiple risk factors at work here, and we'll separate them into non-modifiable and modifiable factors, starting with the non-modifiable ones. Bad news first, right? Let's see what the pirates brought to bury today. Some kind of H.G. Wellsian family portrait painting? That's not fun. At Sketchy, a family portrait represents family history, and in terms of atherosclerosis, this is the most important non-modifiable risk factor. While there are certainly inherited gene mutations that lead to early and excessive atherosclerosis, such as familial hyperlipidemia, homocystinuria, etc., the more general familial risk that we speak of is multifactorial, probably involving genetic polymorphisms affecting lipid metabolism or predisposing patients to other systemic diseases like hypertension or diabetes, the other risk factors on our list. Gender is also important, but is a double-edged sword. Men have atherosclerosis more commonly than premenopausal women. However, after menopause, women have an equal and eventually an even higher risk than men. While the exact reason for this change isn't fully known, our best guess right now is that estrogen has a preventative effect against the development of atherosclerosis, but isn't able to reverse the progression of atherosclerosis once it exists. Time heals all wounds? Lies. In this case, age is actually one of the most important risk factors. This is because plaques become more advanced with time. So much so that the risk of myocardial infarction increases 5 times from age 40 to 60. All right, we get it. You can't change how old you are, whether you were born a man or a woman, or the family you were born into. But here's the good news. There are plenty of modifiable risk factors. By far, the most important modifiable risk factor in the development of atherosclerosis is hyperlipidemia. But there are a lot of substances floating around in the blood that together we call lipidemia. And I would very much recommend our statin steampunk sketch from Sketchy Farm to review all the ins and outs of lipid transport in the blood. In this scene, we'll reuse a lot of those symbols, focusing on the ones that specifically increase the risk of atherosclerosis. Let's start with cholesterol. More specifically, it's hypercholesterolemia, or increased circulating levels of cholesterol. At Sketchy, cholesterol is represented by a cholesterol chest, laden with gold and cholesterol bars. This is the treasure that's going to get buried in the intima and start a chain reaction of damage and inflammation, leading to the development of an atheromatous plaque. Now, when I say cholesterol, you shouldn't imagine naked cholesterol particles floating around in the blood. Instead, these particles get esterified and hitch a ride on circulating lipoproteins. Add together all the cholesterol on all the lipoproteins in the blood, VLDLs, LDLs, HDLs, and you get what's called total cholesterol. We can measure specific lipoprotein fractions as well. Low-density lipoproteins, or LDLs specifically, are laden with the highest concentration of cholesterol. So it goes without saying that elevated LDL levels, or bad cholesterol, increase the risk of atherosclerosis. At Sketchy, LDLs are represented by low-density steampunk ships that float around, transporting cholesterol chests to peripheral tissues throughout the body. High-density lipoproteins are also carrying cholesterol, and this is reported as HDL cholesterol. At Sketchy, HDLs are embodied by these cool Jules Vernean high-density submarines that sink underneath the water. You know, being all high-density and all. HDLs carry the lowest concentration of cholesterol as they circulate around. Not only that, their whole function is to take this cholesterol back to the liver, removing it from the blood. This is your so-called good cholesterol. And these little submarines have even been shown to remove cholesterol from plaques. Score! So, unsurprisingly, low HDL levels increase your risk for atherosclerosis. All in all, remember to discuss lifestyle modification with your patient. Exercise, moderate alcohol intake, and a diet rich in fresh fruits and vegetables can raise HDL levels and reduce LDL. Now, we're not quite done talking about blood stuff, because abnormal elevations in other types of lipid proteins are important as well. How about triglycerides? Represented, as usual, by our triglyceride tritons. Triglycerides from the diet are loaded onto chylomicrons from the intestine and sent off into the circulation. A lot of these triglycerides end up on VLDLs as well. This is measured as serum triglycerides and has been shown to be a risk factor for atherosclerosis. Now, as you'll soon see, it's mainly cholesterol getting buried in the vessel walls to form plaques. So the connection with triglycerides and atherosclerosis is a bit more complex. It's likely that hypertriglyceridemia is associated with other abnormalities that predispose to atherosclerosis, including lower HDLs, more atherogenic LDLs, and insulin resistance. Speaking of insulin resistance, diabetes is another important risk factor for the development of atherosclerosis, embodied by this treasure chest overloaded with diasweeties. Dysfunctional lipid metabolism in patients with diabetes actually leads to elevated total cholesterol and, more specifically, LDL levels. There's even some evidence that chronically elevated insulin levels may affect cellular signaling pathways that increase inflammation in early atherosclerotic plaques. Just wait. Inflammation is going to play a central role here. Hypertension is another risk factor for atherosclerosis, and is especially important because elevated pressures are often the inciting cause of endothelial damage, which creates a nidus for the development of an atherosclerotic plaque. Of course, smoking, one of the biggest culprits for endothelial damage, is definitely one of the most important modifiable risk factors, since it can lead to or worsen many of the conditions we've talked about: hypertension, hyperlipidemia, and atherosclerosis. While it's less common, elevated homocysteine levels have also been shown to be an independent risk factor for atherosclerosis, hence the homocysteine homing beacon they've placed on the treasure. So they can find it later. There are multiple mechanisms by which homocysteine may induce vascular injury, both through direct oxidative damage to the vascular endothelium and by combining with LDL to form aggregates that are taken up by macrophages to be released into atherosclerotic plaques. Low folate, represented by the fallen foliage, as well as low vitamin B12, represented by our recurring cobalamin cobalt fireworks. Both lead to increased homocysteine levels and an increased risk of atherosclerosis, heart attack, and stroke. All told, a little more than 5% of the population have elevated plasma levels of homocysteine. All right, those are the risk factors. Let's jump into the pathogenesis of atherosclerotic plaque formation. Although we'll talk about atherosclerosis as a number of different independent processes, it's important to remember that everything takes place simultaneously, with multiple feedback loops involving many metabolic pathways. We're going to break it up into steps, following a sequence of events known as the reaction to injury theory. And it all starts with our good friend endothelial damage. Endothelial damage is the initial process in the formation of all atherosclerotic lesions. Pretty much all of the risk factors we mentioned earlier, hypertension, tobacco smoke, hyperlipidemia, can cause or accelerate endothelial injury. So think of endothelial damage as the common endpoint of all of these processes. And at this stage, you've created a nidus for plaque formation. In fact, even the normal hemodynamic stresses in large elastic vessels or at the bifurcations of smaller vessels can do enough damage to trigger the sequence of plaque formation. So what happens when the vessel endothelium gets injured? Well, say goodbye to all those hemostatic mechanisms that we discussed earlier, normally responsible for keeping blood nice and, flowy. When endothelial cells can't do their job, the balance of pro- and anticoagulant factors is disturbed, resulting in a prothrombotic state via increased levels of tissue factor and endothelin. These procoagulant pals are depicted by the signs reading too far and end of the line. Notice the thrombotic driftwood accumulating behind them as well. Endothelial cells also upregulate the production of several leukocyte adhesion molecules, including ICAM, intracellular adhesion molecule, VCAM, vascular cell adhesion molecule, and selectin. These surface receptors promote leukocyte adhesion and activation at the site of damaged endothelium. In this scene, this process is reenacted by our little leukocyte adhesion lad. The swab, the low-ranking pirate who's responsible for dragging in the cages to fill with gold. Those macro cages entering the scene represent macrophages, which are now able to adhere and migrate into the vessel wall. Also, at the site of endothelial damage, subendothelial proteins are exposed, facilitating platelet aggregation and activation. So, as the endothelial sand is removed, revealing the subendothelial sand, we've got some plates accumulating. Fine china is my guess. With the endothelium disrupted, small LDL particles sneak into the intima, bringing all that cholesterol with them, as shown by the LDL low-density vessel being buried, along with its load of cholesterol ester chests. Not only that, you see that spray of free radical sparks coming from the macrocage? This is to remind you of the oxygen-free radicals that are formed by local endothelial cells in macrophages. This leads to oxidation of the LDLs, as evidenced by all that rust that's forming. Once oxidized, these LDLs bind to special CD36 scavenger receptors on the surface of macrophages and are promptly endocytosed. It doesn't just stop there, though, because once a macrophage has just one small taste of an oxidized LDL, that's all it can think about. Just gluttonously shoving as many LDLs and cholesterol esters into its mouth as possible, getting all engorged and bloated and just generally unattractive. And before you know it, it turns into one of those pathognomonic, foamy macrophages you've heard so much about, represented by the sea foam that's accumulating around that cholesterol-laden macrocage, almost as if it's foaming at the mouth, thinking about that next scrumptious LDL. Under the microscope, foam cells are enlarged, with prominent amounts of lipid in their cytoplasm. This lipid is comprised primarily of oxidized LDL, cholesterol esters, and a few triglycerides. Macroscopically, when enough foam cells accumulate underneath the vessel endothelium, the lesion starts to take on the appearance of a fatty streak. Ready for an unsettling fact? Fatty streaks are present in the aorta of pretty much every child over the age of 10. Now, not all these lesions are destined to turn into atheromatous plaques. The exact reason why some of these lesions evolve into plaques and others don't is not well understood. But one thing's for sure. Underneath that seemingly benign fatty streak is a smoldering, dynamic system of inflammation and cell death that's just getting started. You see, as foam cells continue to devour every lipid in sight, they release a variety of cytokines and chemokines. This is illustrated over at the next pile. Just look at all those shiny cytocoins tumbling out of that lipid-filled macro cage. Enticing, right? With all of these chemotactic cytokines floating around, along with an increased expression of leukocyte adhesion molecules, T cells get recruited into the intima as well. And in this scene, they're represented by these prized Squire-themed gold figurines. T cells release even more cytokines and chemokines into the area. So we've added some more coins to the pile. And don't forget about those platelets. After latching onto exposed subendothelial structures, platelets are getting activated left and right, releasing their own set of cytokines and chemokines into the local milieu. So, as you can see, central to this whole process is chronic inflammation. All those cytokines call even more foamy macrophages and T cells, and the vicious cycle continues. On top of that, inflammation causes additional endothelial damage, allowing even more LDLs to sneak in. You just can't win. Remember, this is all happening in the intima. And as more cells join the party, intimal thickening becomes evident on histology, just like this bulging mound of sand which lies above the media and externa seaweed layers. Man, I just want to dig in there and tap that pirate booty. Know what I'm talking about? Let's take a peek inside, shall we? And look at the specific cellular and structural changes that occur as this fatty streak turns into a full-on atheromatous plaque. Oh, avast ye, or blimey, or whatever. Looks like we've attracted some uninvited guests. This rival pirate gang is disguised in pink seaweed in order to evoke an image of smooth muscle cells. And as they climb ashore, attracted by all those shiny cytocoins, they reenact the migration of smooth muscle cells from the media into the intima. What are smooth muscle cells doing in the intima, you say? Well, pretty much all the players we've introduced, including endothelial cells, macrophages, T cells, even platelets, are responsible for releasing special cytokines and growth factors that actually change the phenotype of the smooth muscle cells in the media. Let's put it this way. We've given these boring contractile muscle cells an upgrade. Their extracellular matrix is degraded, allowing them to migrate upward. They've even gained some phagocytic function and gobble up LDLs and cholesterol much like a macrophage. These smooth muscle imposters are also locked into an active synthetic state. See that aptly placed shark hat camouflage? At Sketchy, a shark means cartilage. And in this scene, it should remind you of the excessive amounts of extracellular matrix proteins and collagen secreted by these renegade smooth muscle cells. And here's another thing. These cells don't just migrate, they proliferate. So let's draw in one of his smooth muscle buddies. This marching army of cells, along with all newly secreted collagen, forms a fibrous capsule overlying the lipid core underneath, effectively walling off the lipid collection from the rest of the vessel. At this point, you can see all the classic histological features of a fully formed atherosclerotic plaque. You've got your fibrous cap on top, made of collagen and smooth muscle cells. Underneath is, just a bloodbath. It's not pretty. Foamy macrophages pretty much engorge themselves to death and undergo necrosis and apoptosis. This triggers smooth muscle cells to undergo apoptosis as well. And before you know it, you're left with an expanded gooey lipid core, full of cholesterol crystals, oxidized LDL, cellular debris. Calcifications might be visible on histology as well. Just remnants of necrotic cells. And regrets. And unfulfilled dreams. Growth factors also promote angiogenesis, leading to a network of thin-walled blood vessels that extend from the adventitia, supplying oxygen and nutrients to the growing plaque. Uh-oh, looks like there's a bit of an internal skirmish. Some kind of disagreement about how the gold is going to be divided. Turns out that angry macrophages and smooth muscle cells start producing an arsenal of metalloproteinases. Metalloproteinases excel at digesting extracellular matrix, including the fibrous cap protecting the atheroma from the vessel lumen. In the later stages, the degree of plaque remodeling and collagen breakdown has an extremely important effect on the stability of the plaque and its risk of rupture. All right, at this point, landlubbers, you have a mature, evolving atheromatous plaque that's pretty much a ticking time bomb. Once you've got a mature plaque in place, atheromatous lesions can undergo one of 3 different fates, all of which have pretty terrible consequences. Like we've said, atherosclerotic plaques can have dramatic thickening of the intima and media. When these plaques get thick enough, diffusion of oxygen and nutrients from the vessel lumen to the media becomes impaired, which weakens the outer vessel walls. This leads to cystic medial necrosis, a fancy term for when the smooth muscle-rich media of the vessel wall turns into necrotic mush. With the structural integrity of the vessel compromised, this area becomes the perfect place for aneurysm formation and, when it gets large enough, rupture. Check out our aneurysm sketch for more details. If the fibrous cap hangs in there and allows the atheromatous plaques to grow stably, stenosis of the affected vessel can develop as the plaque overtakes more and more of the vessel lumen. When the plaque occludes more than 70% of the vessel lumen, we reach what's called critical stenosis. See how his blacksmith caliper thingies form the number 70? This is when clinical symptoms start to manifest. Cardiac angina, transient ischemic attacks, peripheral arterial disease, and even renal artery stenosis can be caused by atheromatous plaques preventing adequate blood flow from getting to the target organs. Don't worry, these conditions will get plenty of coverage in their own videos throughout this course. As bad as these late complications of atherosclerosis are, though, it gets even worse. Atherosclerotic plaque rupture is the most feared consequence of all, and accounts for almost all cardiovascular deaths. That's a story for another time, however. So be sure to check out the cardio unit for everything about plaque rupture and ACS. All right, time to head up to the poop deck and sum up the sketch. Atherosclerosis is ubiquitous. Like cat pictures on the internet. You cannot escape it, but you can understand it. What puts you at risk for a long, slow walk of the plank towards Davy Jones' locker? Family history, male gender, but don't forget about postmenopausal women. Age, hypercholesterolemia, hypertriglyceridemia, diabetes, which actually compounds the previous 2, low HDL, smoking, homocystinemia, and, of course, hypertension. Damage to the endothelium is the start of atherosclerotic plaque development, which makes sense. Not only does it reduce the normal antithrombotic factors released by endothelial cells, but causes inflammation, exposes collagen to allow platelet binding, and, most importantly, provides an opening for the entrance of oxidized LDL and cholesterol esters. Lipids entering the vessel wall undergo phagocytosis by macrophages, further activate inflammation, and form the first intermediate of atherosclerotic plaques, the fatty streak. As this process steams ahead, accumulation of lipid, foamy macrophages, lymphocytes, and necrotic cells cause intimal thickening. Inflammation plays a key role here, remember. Cytokines, chemokines, and growth factors are released, calling over smooth muscle cells, which migrate to the intima, where they transform into lipid-eating, collagen-secreting scallywags. When enough smooth muscle cells move to the intima and secrete collagen, a fibrous cap is formed. Think of this as capping the well, so to speak. However, unthinkable things are happening in the darkness just below. Macrophages gobble lipid, smooth muscle cells proliferate and die, more lipid accumulates, more inflammatory mediators are released, and pretty much all cells undergo apoptosis to fill the vessel wall with a lipid core. When a vessel lumen is obstructed by 70% due to an atherosclerotic plaque, it's termed critical stenosis, which can block blood flow enough to cause angina, TIA, peripheral arterial disease, renal artery stenosis, etc. And don't forget about aneurysm formation either. Even worse, plaque rupture and MI. But avast ye, that's an adventure for another time.